Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. You're tuning into this whilst I'm relaxing on a beach in Turkey, and I'm sure you're all very jealous, although don't be, because I assure you, even though I am recording this prior, I know for a fact I'm already sunburnt. I got sunburnt in the UK at the weekend, so it's almost 100% a given. We're heading over to Turkey this week and ancient Mesopotamia itself, and looking at another awesome storm bird from this part of the world this week, and their name is Anzû. Anzû is described as a massive eagle-like bird that can transform into the same size storm cloud at any point, with a lion's head that roared to create thunder. It was described as being an immense size, but we're not entirely sure how big. But what we do know is that it was at least the size of a small house, with a wingspan of at least 60 feet. Not only this, it had razor-sharp claws and a sharp beak that could pull apart any prey, and a call that could be heard in other Middle Eastern countries when angered. Depending on what mythology you look at them through, they could be described as both malevolent and benevolent, or even going from one to the other, as well as sometimes being described as demonic too. But thankfully, they didn't eat humans, which is a bonus for us. They lived mostly on large mammals and fish, which they would strike down from a considerable height, and they were also able to fly, just as a precursor to that, which sometimes is an issue with mythological birds when they're bigger sized. Now, that's about it in terms of a description of what it actually looks like, which I know is minimal, but for their powers there is a little bit more. They have complete control over the storm and weather, and are able to cause hurricanes, tornadoes, and storms in certain areas. They were also able to transform into humans if they so wished, and this was because, as well as being described as demonic, they could also sometimes be described as being godly. Because of this, they could also grant powers of anything the person desired to worthy worshippers who provided the bird with gifts, and tell others their fate if they so wanted. So, where did this bird come from? It's thought that Anzû was an early form of the Mesopotamian god Abu, who was believed to be a god of the underworld due to his link to vegetation, snakes, and godly death, and he was actually referred to as Father Pasture, as in putting things out to pasture. Abu joined with the god of thunderstorms, Ninurta, who we will come back to later on for many stories, and they came together to represent the rainstorms watering the crops in the spring. Anzû emerged from the pure waters of the Absu, or the primordial waters in the earth, and sprang forth into the world as a young mythical titan monster. However, Anzû has been thought to have just been a solo female deity who is able to lay eggs and procreate, but how, we do not know. But other than emerging from the earth when it was born, you would find them in gigantic nests on top of mountains, far away from humans. Could you kill this monster though? It does sound pretty godly and vicious, and, well, it would take an entire army with enchanted weapons and a god to do so I wouldn't recommend trying. The best way to take Anzû out would be to wait until it tires itself out, then get all of the weak spots whilst its guard is down. It was considered quite a sneaky bird, considering its size, and very, very power hungry, so it is definitely not to be messed with. For their etymology, there's actually considerable argument about this within the mythology space, due to the various languages and pronunciations within regions. In Akkadian mythology, An means heavenly and Zu means eagle, but in Sumerian, it's Muzan, which means bird. In Babylonian, its name is taken from the Anzû that it emerges from, but no one can really decide on a definitive answer. Speaking of which, I didn't really go into where this monster comes from. Ancient Mesopotamia is super interesting, as it is split into different countries and different historical periods where different people were in charge of culture and society. These countries were modern-day Iran, Iraq, Turkey and Kuwait, and from 3500 BC, when the Sumerian culture was king, through to Akkadian culture in 2350 BC, Babylonian in 2000 BC, and Assyrian from 1500 BC to 500 BC. There have been a lot of changes within the microcosm of Mesopotamian culture. Anzû appears in all of these different religions and mythologies within these times, and it is sometimes understood very differently depending on where you are. This kicks us off really nicely into history though, and we believe that Anzû has been around since the Sumerian culture, so around 3500 BC, making them one of our oldest mythical monsters we've covered. We have this backed up by a load of myths about them from epics from around the time, which are usually described as ancient prose and poetry. The first story of Anzû is from Sumerian culture, from an epic called Lugalbanda and Enmerkar. Lugalbanda was a Sumerian king of Urk, which is in modern-day Iraq, that turned into a god. Lugalbanda ends up getting lost in the Zabu Mountains, where he decides to visit Anzû and his family to sing their praises and get something in return, like what you should expect when you go to someone else's house. Lugalbanda climbs into the mountain's peak and finds Anzû's chick nesting and decides to cover the baby bird in luxuries whilst its dad is out hunting. Anzû comes home and finds the king and the presents and is super grateful and grants him magical powers of super speed, but makes the king promise to form a cult around the magic of Anzû themselves in Urk when he gets home. The king agrees and moves on with his life. That is the end of that myth. However, this myth is picked back up again in the journey of Ninurta to Eridu. I did say that Ninurta would come back at some point, he's the storm god, and in this one, Anzû guides the god to Abzu and tells the god his fate and to thank the monster, who is technically kind of his child. The god promises to create another cult in Anzû's name and make a beautiful statue of his likeness. Now, the last myth around Anzû is also his last, the myth of Anzû and the Tablet of Destiny, which is from Babylonian texts. In this one, Anzû decides to get sneaky and peek on the god Enlil, who was the king of all Sumerian gods, and steal his tablet, which contains all of his power. He does so, and the gods freak out until they decide that Ninurta, once again, should be the god to sort him out, as he loved a bit of war. Ninurta raises an army against Anzû with enchanted weapons, but Anzû uses the tablet to dismantle all of them. There are so many though, that the bird is having to constantly focus to take them apart, making him really tired. In this moment, Ninurta cut off the beast's wings and killed him, which restored order to the godly cosmos of Babylonia. And Anzû is briefly mentioned in the Sumerian epic most people know, Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, in the story of Inanna and the Hellepu tree. But just kind of sitting in the tree, so there's not much else to tell you about this one, but Anzû is in it at some point. From these texts, it's tricky to justify Anzû's last mistake. However, we can't ignore that Anzû is the perfect personification of nature and how unpredictable and deadly it can be, which matches his nature itself and his powers. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of this information from old statues and physical art, which has worn away over the centuries, and so the only real people who know how good or how bad Anzû was were the ancient Mesopotamians, and they are longer than long gone. I guess in conclusion to these stories, to us as mythical monster fans, Anzû just seems like another stormy bird, and this trope happens across a lot of mythologies. Eagles, falcons and hawks are usually linked with storms because of their high flight preference, as well as their massive size and big appetite. So they naturally do create a fear in us as well as a sense of respect. I think it's a pretty healthy and human way to look at these massive birds, and as always, it wouldn't surprise me if they were just a case of mistaken identity when these ancient civilizations were around and just didn't know about the species of birds. I certainly wouldn't want an eagle coming after my chips. I freak out when a seagull gives me a longer stare than usual with a seaside donut in my hand, let alone an eagle pouncing down on me. For mythical comparisons though, of course there are a few. We have the roc from Arabic mythology, another classic large storm bird, although that one does seem to have a slightly more antagonistic view than this one. We also have the thunderbird from Native American mythology, which lives up to its name and truly would be terrifying, punishing locals for disrespecting nature and the bird itself. And lastly, we have the griffin in terms of looks from the British folklore space, but they don't really have the godly or the storm touch about them. They just look slightly similar with the lion head and the bird body. But let's move on to modern media. There are a few bits here and there, but not very much for this monster. So I filled this out with storm bird media that'll tickle your fancy for this one. For art, there aren't really any classical pieces around this monster, but you can find them in stone and statues a lot. The most famous is Ninurta with his thunderbolts pursues Anzû by Austen Henry Layard from 1853, which is a gorgeous piece of work, but otherwise have a look at the independent artists this week for some really cool Stormbird inspired artwork around Anzû. In movies we have Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, Sinbad, The Legend of the Seven Seas, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, Aladdin, and The Magic Crane. For TV, we have My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, One Piece, Digimon, Raideen, Hilda, Power Rangers Mystical Force, Gargoyles, and Aladdin the series. In video games, we have ones such as Devil May Cry 1 and 5, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, Don't Starve, Fantasy Life, Final Fantasy IV, 7 and 8, Etrian Odyssey, Extra Power Star Resistance, Genshin Impact, Heroes of Might and Magic, Horizon Zero Dawn, Warcraft 3, Zelda 3 The Adventure of Link, Thunderbird Strike, Pokemon, Mega Man 5, World of Warcraft, Shadow Hearts from the New World, Shin Megami Tensei, and Terraria Thorium. My book recommendation this week, I would have to say, is have a look at Arabic Folk Tales, Collection of Ancient Tales of the East by Elena Grand, or Myths from Mesopotamian Creation, The Flood, Gilgamesh and Others by Stephanie Daly for more ancient Arabic stories from this part of the world. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? I'm really sorry, and this has been a few episodes running now, but I have to say no, again. This is because of my usual answer when it comes to oversized monsters. We would just have spotted them by now. And especially with the food that it would be eating and where it's based, it would only make sense that we'd either have weaponised or found and killed them all. I love stormbirds though. I've covered them a few times in the last few years, and I'm genuinely a bit scared I might run out of them soon, which I think would be a travesty. The idea of a bird controlling the weather is awesome, especially one driven by their own desire like a magpie, although I'm sure Anzû or any other thunderbird would be genuinely upset at that comparison, but I did also compare them to a seagull earlier, I suppose. I imagine Anzû would be this gorgeous dusky blue eagle with gold glitters glittering in the sunlight, as it absolutely destroys the local population for not leaving it enough gifts. And that's pretty cool. There is an Anzû in World of Warcraft who looks very similar to that idea, so maybe that's where I'm getting that inspiration from. I actually have a mount of Anzû that I can ride, and it's like a raven god. It's very cool. Anyway. But what do you think? Did Anzû roam the skies of ancient Mesopotamia? Let me know on Twitter. I would love to know what you think about this one. A really interesting monster this week. I loved the character arc of this monster throughout the myths, that falling from grace into a total antagonistic god thief, which immediately makes it more interesting, and that it's kind of a god itself, absolute genius. I also really enjoyed researching this one and writing it down for you guys and presenting it, I suppose. It was a really interesting one to learn about, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Next week, we are heading over to the beautiful island of Hawaii to look at some banana and fish-loving dwarves. If you've got a DIY project, leave out your tools for the expert craftsman, the Menehuna, next Thursday. For now, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. And you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky. And I'll see you later, babes.